March 28th, 1757, Paris is suffocating under the weight of its own curiosity. Over 100,000 people flood the narrow streets, their shouts and shoves echoing off the stone walls. Some climb onto rooftops, others push toward makeshift stands. Fortunes change hands for the best vantage point. At first glance, it feels like the city is preparing for a royal celebration. But the air carries no joy, only a thick, unsettling tension. This is not a wedding, not a parade. It is a public killing, and not just any killing. Today, the crowd will watch a man be torn apart alive in a performance of cruelty that will stretch across 4 agonizing hours. The victim is Robert-François Damiens, a 42-year-old servant guilty of a single act that shook France to its core. He had dared to strike the king. It began on January 5th, 1757, in the gardens of Versailles. The winter air bit at the skin as King Louis XV descended the palace stairs. Courtiers whispered. Guards stood at ease until a man emerged from the crowd. Damiens lunged forward, a small knife in hand, and stabbed the king in the back. The blade pierced flesh, but not deeply enough to kill. A few stitches closed the wound. Physically, the king would recover, but symbolically, the damage was irreparable. For 2 centuries, no one had laid a violent hand on a French king. The crown was not just political, it was sacred. The king's body was considered divine, untouchable. Damiens' act was seen not merely as attempted murder, but as a spiritual violation, a tear in the very fabric of the monarchy's authority. Damiens was not an assassin sent by foreign enemies, nor a revolutionary leader. He was a restless, unstable servant, drifting between noble households. He often spoke in erratic bursts about religion, politics, and moral decay. In the months before the attack, he lost job after job, his bitterness deepening. His ramblings hinted at frustration with both church and state. But there was no grand conspiracy, only a man spiraling toward desperation. That didn't matter. He had touched the king, and in 18th century France, that was enough to seal his fate. His trial was over almost before it began. Less than 2 months after the attack, he was found guilty of parricide, the killing or attempted killing of a father, in this case, the symbolic father of the nation. The sentence, death, but not a quick death. The court demanded a spectacle, an execution designed not only to kill Damiens, but to etch terror into the hearts of all who witnessed it. Officials scoured medieval records for forgotten tortures. They consulted surgeons to ensure Damiens would remain alive and conscious for every stage. Nobles would be seated comfortably in special stands. Commoners would fill the square. All would have an unbroken view of the suffering. On the morning of March 28th, Damiens was dragged from his cell in the Conciergerie prison. Bound in an open cart, he was paraded through Paris, jeered at by the swelling crowd. By the time he reached the Place de Grève, the square was a living sea of faces. Schools closed, shops locked their doors. No one wanted to miss what was being promised as the event of the century. At the center of the square, a wooden platform awaited. Damiens was stripped naked and tied down. Stage 1 began with red-hot pincers. The executioners worked methodically, chest, arms, thighs, and the right hand that had held the knife. Flesh tore away in chunks. Damiens' screams cut through the noise, raw and unhuman, as if an animal were being slaughtered alive. Eyewitnesses later wrote of people weeping, others vomiting, but most stayed rooted in place. The show had just begun. Stage 2 followed quickly. Molten lead, boiling oil, and burning resin poured into the fresh wounds. The stench of scorched flesh mingled with the smoke. clinging to the crowd's clothes. Damiens thrashed so violently he broke 2 chains. Each time he lost consciousness, cold water revived him. No reprieve, only the promise of more pain. Among the onlookers was the infamous adventurer Casanova. In his memoirs he recalled, "I saw men vomit, women faint, and children carried away crying, but no one looked away. We were glued to the horror." 2 hours had passed, and the worst was still to come. 2 hours into the execution, the crowd had already witnessed enough pain to last a lifetime. Yet the real climax was still ahead. Stage 3 was the grand finale, the dismemberment by horses. 4 large, muscular animals were brought forward, their breath steaming in the cool air. Ropes were tied to Damien's wrists and ankles, each horse facing a different direction. The plan was simple in theory: pull until the body gave way. At the signal, the horses strained, muscles rippling under the leather harnesses. The ropes went taut. Damien's limbs stretched grotesquely, but his body held. Tendons and ligaments resisted the tearing force. The crowd began to murmur in frustration. Some jeered, others shouted for more force. But no matter how the executioners urged the horses, the man remained in one piece, his body trembling under the unimaginable pressure. The executioners conferred quickly, realizing brute force alone would not finish the job. The solution was horrifying. Knives were brought out, and in full view of the crowd, they began cutting through the tendons and muscles at Damien's joints. He was still alive, still conscious. Witnesses later swore they heard him beg for mercy, pleading for an end. But an executioner reportedly told him coldly, "There is no mercy for regicides." With the tendon severed, the horses pulled again. This time, there was a sickening snap. His right arm tore free, followed by his left leg. Cheers erupted from the stands. A moment later, the left arm gave way, and still, unbelievably, he lived. Blood poured from the stumps, pooling beneath the platform. Those standing close enough could see his lips moving, as if trying to speak. His eyes were open, unfocused, but alive. By now, the mood in the square began to shift. Some who had been cheering now looked pale and sick. Parents hurried children away. Even hardened spectators began to whisper. Had this gone too far? The chief executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, stepped forward. For over 3 hours, he'd carried out the court's command. But the end had finally come. With a swift stroke of his blade, he slit Damien's throat, ending the nightmare. Yet even in death, the punishment was not complete. By royal order, no trace of him could remain. The mutilated remains were gathered and carried to a massive bonfire built nearby. The flames roared, consuming flesh and bone alike, until nothing was left but ash. The crowd stood silent, watching the smoke curl into the sky. From the moment Damiens had been dragged from his cell to the final burst of fire, 4 hours and 15 minutes had passed. 4 hours of calculated, methodical suffering. 4 hours that would stain the conscience of France. In the days that followed, Paris seemed haunted. Some who had been in the square could not sleep. Others said the smell of burning flesh lingered in their clothes. Many refused to eat meat for weeks. The memory of Damien's screams clung to them like a shadow they could not shake. The execution of Robert-François Damiens did not fade quietly into history. It burned itself into the conscience of an entire continent. News traveled quickly. In London, Amsterdam, and Vienna, newspapers printed lurid descriptions of the Paris spectacle. Some wrote with a tone of fascination, others with horror. Philosophers in Europe's coffeehouses and salons debated not whether Damiens was guilty, but whether any crime, no matter how monstrous, could justify such cruelty. Voltaire, already a fierce critic of injustice, called it barbaric and unworthy of a civilized nation. Denis Diderot, the Enlightenment thinker, wrote that executions like this turned the state into the very monster it claimed to be fighting. Even in France, many nobles whispered in private that the king's judges had gone too far, turning punishment into theater. For the monarchy, the event was a double-edged sword. In the short term, it projected power, an unmistakable warning that the king's life was sacred and untouchable. But in the long term, it sowed seeds of doubt. Ordinary people began to wonder, if the crown could be this merciless to one man, what mercy could it ever show to the rest of France? Historians now view Damiens' death as one of the last great public executions of its kind in France. Within a few decades, such medieval spectacles would vanish. By the time of the French Revolution, the guillotine, swift, clinical, and impersonal, had replaced drawn-out tortures. It was not kindness that ended these punishments, but efficiency. The state no longer needed theater, it needed speed. Damiens himself left no legacy beyond the manner of his death. He had no movement, no followers, no cause that survived him, and yet his final hours lived on in history books, in memoirs, in whispered retellings. His name became a shorthand for the ultimate fate of those who challenged the monarchy. The Place de Grève, where thousands once gathered to cheer, now stands as a quiet square in modern Paris. No marker tells passers-by what happened there on that cold March day. Tourists walk across it without knowing they tread on the ground where a man was broken piece by piece before a nation's eyes. Looking back, it's tempting to see Damiens as merely a criminal, or perhaps a madman who acted without reason. But history reminds us that his death was not only about him. It was about the world that allowed such cruelty to exist, the rulers who demanded it, and the crowds who could not look away. Centuries later, the question still lingers in the air like smoke. Was Robert-François Damiens' execution a moment of justice, or a mirror showing France the darkness in its own soul?